Thank you, Fadini. So great to be here. I'm Shayan, I'm currently CTO of Ether Capital, and I'll be presenting this paper. So before we start jumping in the paper, I just have to make sure we're on the same page. To define the oracle, you have to define the context. So basically, for the context of this paper, we define the oracle as a bridge or a gateway that connects the off-chain real-world knowledge to the on-chain blockchain network. And you may have heard an oracle problem, which in this paper we discuss, and we believe it's still a real problem. And to define that as well, basically for many applications on the blockchain, we need this interface to the external world from the blockchain environment. That is a fundamental of this oracle problem, but many of the implementations basically have a trust in this interface or use a centralized service. And if we are doing so, then why are we bothering using trustless, decentralized smart contract when the main data is coming from a centralized or trusted point? So just to know, for use cases on Oracle, we have many use cases like stable coins or synthetic assets, derivatives or prediction markets, which most of these use basically price data from outside blockchain, provenance systems, identity, randomness like chain and VRF, and a lot more use cases. So just before jumping again in this paper, I want to do a flashback to this other paper we worked on in 2017, which was one of my first interactions with smart contracts and the Oracle problem. So in there, we basically talked about how to design a decentralized derivative markets and documented challenges, design decisions. And one of the main reasons this paper was done was discussing the Oracle problems and trusts in the system. So the main natural question like any smart contract developer should ask is, if we are trusting the Oracle, then why not just have it compute everything? And many of the Oracle designs that we looked at in this paper and overall, they always had one deep centralized point. And there was no real way to measure or a framework to analyze and compare the oracles. And that's why basically we work on this paper. So this is a systemization of knowledge paper on everything we know and there is about blockchains or Oracle. We basically come up with this framework to analyze oracles and look into them and some of the attacks and mitigations and basically how to rethink the Oracle design. I just want to shout out to the awesome co-authors here, Mehdi, Catherine, and Jeremy, which we work on this paper for almost 2 years. And I'm glad that we were able to present here. So for this framework, we use a modular workflow. Basically, we break the design of the Oracle system into modules and we go through each one of them, basically putting ourselves in the data's shoes and trying to see what happens there. And just a disclaimer, if you've never thought about creating or understanding or analyzing an Oracle system, probably these slides might not make sense to you or it would be irrelevant, but at the end, they all come together. And really, depending on the design, these modules can be reordered, but most of them have all these modules. So the main modules that we use to understand the Oracle system are these 6, which I'm going to go through. But consider that if your Oracle is not using everything on chain, you need to have price data, you need to get this information from off-chain to on-chain data and on-chain smart contract, and there's more modules involved. And some of the Oracle designs we've seen really don't look deeper into these modules, but a lot of attacks actually use some of the blockchain infrastructure or smart contracts to actually attack Oracle systems. So this is really crucial to look at. And so to begin these modules, the first challenge is to ask this philosophical question that what is truth? Is the truth objective or subjective? And here, if I ask all the participants here that what is the real price of Ethereum to you, you would not come up with the same number. They're different numbers, different currencies, and different things. So we just want to make sure that we find the best way to get the raw data and aggregate them to have a reasonable data quality. The second module here is the data sources, basically the passive entities that store and measure the representation of ground truth, which could be databases or APIs, like central exchanges, sensors, or humans for like prediction markets, some others, smart contracts, which could be on-chain, like Uniswap as an Oracle data source, or a combination of these. In the paper, we have some interesting details and possible attacks on these data sources, which I'm not going to go into detail here. Data feeders are basically entities that gather and report the data from the source to the Oracle system. A common configuration is basically external feeder, drawing from the off-chain data source and depositing the data on an on-chain module, which if you're using, as I said, on-chain data, you won't have data feeders. And this module is not attempting to determine if the data is falsified, true or not. There are later modules that deal with this, but mainly consists of like tunneling the data through the feeder with some security provisions, like making sure this, the source authentication or integrity of the system, integrity of the data, or some other confidentiality, which there are more details coming. The next module, which is really crucial, is the selection of data feeders, meaning that all these data feeders are coming in. How can we weed out less qualified participants? And basically, this increases the resilience of the system if we have more data feeders, but there are some trade-offs. So we have like a centralized allow list selection, which MakerDAO Oracle V1 was using, was a list of allowed oracles to like price feeders to feed the price. In order to make the goal like distribute the trust, we can use this decentralized allow list selection. There are different methods. One is voting, which MakerDAO V2 is using for voting, but we've seen that like it's possible for someone that accumulates more votes to kind of like attack the system. There was an incident with B protocol that used a flash loan to pass their proposal on being added to the read-only allow list, which because it was not considered malicious, we don't consider it as an attack, but it's a possibility. And we have like a staking, which mechanically is different from voting, meaning that data feeders can post collateral against the data they provide. And if they're lying or if the data is falsified, later on they would be punished or collateral slashed. And like some other systems like Chainlink use reputation-based selection, which we still consider losing reputation as slashing because it would be reduced income from future jobs. And the level of decentralization here really matters because you could also, if all the data feeders are using the same data source, then there's not really like a decentralization here. And also some other projects use randomness on top of these, like Teller uses a proof of work style, like style selection to choose like 5 data feeders out of all the data feeders that have like fed the data. And one of the crucial parts in this system is the aggregation phase, meaning that you have to get all these data feeds that were approved to get the single number out. And just to like highlight how important this is, like there was an incident with Synthetics, which is a trading platform. They were using like average of 2 data feeders at the aggregation method. And one attacker basically leveraged this to manipulate one of the feeders by inflating the real price there. And because it was the average of the price of these two, the price on the Synthetics changed significantly. And basically there was a loss of $1 million, a few $1 million there. So as I said, like there are different methods, statistical measures, mean, median, depending on what kind of data you're using. More secure way, but less real-time price is using rating methods, which is like similar to TWAP, which is used in Uniswap version 2 and version 3. You can use a time period or volume or other things to make sure there's more resiliency toward like market manipulation. And also you can use some kind of like random selection to make sure no one feeder can play with the system. And also the one main part here is like the aggregation phase should be able to deal with any expired data or stale data, like similar incidents to the Black Thursday in May 2020. Was basically aggregations were not using any methods to like check the timestamp of the data or some other, basically the timestamp of the latest update. Another part that is also really crucial is the dispute phase, which basically safeguards the quality of the final output and gives the stakeholder a chance to mitigate inclusion of wrong data. The dispute phase is a kind of a double-edged sword. I'll explain a bit about that. But the idea is to be able to distinguish and to detect and remove any bad data provider. So we have two different methods: provider level or data level vetting, meaning that the provider level the provider-oriented system would focus on selecting the honest data providers and using dispute to remove malicious or faulty data providers from the future rounds or future data rounds, similar to like MakerDAO allow list, so you can remove them from future. The data-oriented ones are different. They vet the data itself, and they result in a slower system as the data is staged for dispute period before it's finalized, but it can correct false data. And one example, as I said, is a double-edged sword, is like Augur, which uses like a 1 day for every data point as a dispute phase. For everyone has like 1 day to vote on that or dispute that level, and that can be extended to 7 days. So when we have this, when let's say a data is disputed, we need a method to determine the truth. And if we already have the correct data to use a reference, why not just use that instead of going through the whole Oracle system? So we have different approaches. We have like a statistical approach with staking, meaning that a bunch of people can dispute, put their true data out there with stake, and if they're still wrong, they would slashed, or they would be rewarded for telling the truth and fixing the system. But one main challenge is like the acceptable threshold for slashing, meaning that a large threshold tolerates moderately incorrect data without punishment, but a small threshold could punish data feeders that are honest but a bit faulty or slow, or just it's a volatile data. And like voting works similarly. There is an interesting one using like arbitrage, which mostly uses like a similar to exchange rate between two on-chain tokens. One project that uses this is called Nest protocol, which the mechanics are similar to the when someone initiates a Uniswap liquidity providing and sets the initial price. But then there is some crypto economics to make sure that price is right. If it's not, someone else can use that as an arbitrage method and basically fix the price. But consider that like this also can be manipulated by spending money. One last thing about this. So there is some other project called like UMA uses this formulas to figure out if cost of corruption is greater than the profit from corruption and measure this threshold based on that. But we should consider that like the cost of and the profit from corruption might not be an easy thing to calculate. It could be outside blockchain and outside Ethereum. And one last part is when we figure out the data and the correctness of data, we need to have a consequence for required data. Like it could be reverted, meaning that the outcome result would be annulled and the whole system would start from the scratch. While we can also correct the data, meaning that we just get rid of the disputed data and just use whatever is left there. And there is, it really depends on the complexity of the system, and consider that like this whole thing can be used to halt the system and or attack the correct data or just delay the finality of the data. As the example, like Augur has this implemented, has this phase for every phase has like 24 hours dispute phase, which can be extended to 7 days based on how many disputes there are. But if there are 2.5% of all the rep tokens, which is Augur's token, are in this dispute, the whole market, all the prediction markets would enter this 60 days settlement phase called the fork window, which all the rep holders should vote. So that basically halts the system. So that could be used for attacking basically the dispute phase. So using these all modules, we basically came up with this table. There are like all the oracles, either academic or actual implementation in this table, and we try to like put them using this framework. Just want to say that this table itself has a limited shelf life of usefulness because these projects evolve, they change, but the workflow itself, the modules, submodules, and the design choices are based on the general principle and intended to have a long-lasting usefulness. And as I said, so if you're using an on-chain blockchain on-chain data source like Uniswap, you won't have this interacting with blockchain, but any other source of data, you would need to get the data into the blockchain. And I'm just gonna like go through these really fast. Mainly this whole slide is about availability. Like if you're using any off-chain infrastructure, availability is the key and really crucial. You can have like a one single server like town crier or many nodes that intercommunicate to their own consensus protocol like Chainlink OCR, but it should be available and then have service resistance. And also things like the private key can be used if it should not be compromised because it can impersonate the oracle and attack the rest of the system. Like dynamic gas fees or positive balance for gas, like it could prevent attacks like what happened in September 2020 to some of the Chainlink nodes that basically they lost around 700 ETH and they ran out of gas and some other similar attacks. The other one is like the blockchain node, which is mainly about the network partitioning attack or some of the MEV attacks that you should consider in your design to make sure the oracle is not prone to these attacks. And just gonna skip through these because I don't have that much time. And just the main point of these is like some of the food for thoughts here is some of the oracles, they use like governance token for staking. This makes sure that the market is capitalized enough and there is material. The token should be distributed because we need a decentralized system. And how we can incentivize on-chain oracle use cases with no direct revenue when there's no price, similar to weather data. Or we can also push for more diversity in the system to promote resilience in the system. Let's say if everyone's using Chainlink and Chainlink for some reason the market cap is crashed, that makes the whole system less secure. And also knowing that one cannot ever capture the whole extent of profit from corruption because a lot of them could be outside the Ethereum and the smart contract world. I think I'm almost in time, but this went by really fast. So.
All right, thank you, Shayan. If people have questions, please post them on the chat box. In the meantime, although you have listed some of these on your very last slide, could you identify in your own opinion what is the most important open problem that your SoK points to?
Yeah, so the first problem is something actually like Vitalik Buterin on Honorius's blogs talked about, that like using something like Uniswap might be a good token to use for staking on like Oracle outcomes. But one thing I'm really interested in is the second one, that like we have a lot of Oracle projects about price data because it's incentivized by the price and the markets. But there are so many use cases that are not being used because like the data is not available on chain, similar to weather data. Like we might need an insurance use case or some others. So I'm really interested to see if anyone has like more use cases about anything non-financial using oracles on chain, which would be really interesting to work on. Yeah.
All right. If there are no more questions for Shayan, let's thank him again and let's move on to the next